Hi there, my name is Aspen Lillywhite. Today I'll be sharing with you my research looking at the coverage of artificial intelligence and machine learning within academic literature, Canadian newspapers, and Twitter, specifically focusing on disabled people. I'm the presenting author today, but Dr. Gregor Wilbring was also a key contributor in this study. I'd just like to acknowledge these organizations here and also acknowledge my research group, the Woolpack. So to begin, as many of you know, AI would be the study of how computers are trained to do things at which this time people do better, and then machine learning is when we start getting computers to teach themselves and learn without being taught by the human being. And then as a result, various countries have established AI strategies, Canada being one of them. And our AI strategy wants to target how AI poses challenges or changes within society in regard to the economy, ethics, philosophy, and the law. Now, AI can be discussed within the phrases of social good or common good, and there even exists a ethical framework known as AI for the social good, which targets societal issues that have not yet received significant attention and need to be further explored. And so the concept of social good can be applied in many settings. Now, AI and ML have been applied to numerous different scientific and technological endeavors, and disabled people, as a result, are impacted by this scientific advancement. They can be directly impacted by being therapeutic or non-therapeutic users of these technologies, and they are also indirectly impacted by changing societal parameters. For example, this might be how AI is outperforming human beings and how that might impact the workplace, for example. For my study specifically, language and terminology is very important in analyzing that. And we know that how disabled people are defined is linked to their social identity. And within AI and ML narratives, disabled people have the potential to hold various roles. That might include being a patient, being a consumer of these technologies, or further, they might be involved as a designer or influencer as these technologies are being developed, or in more of a negative connotation, they might be a victim of these technologies. So tone, portrayal, and imagery, as we've started to unpack, really defines how disabled people are portrayed. Oftentimes, we see the medical imagery closely linked to disabled people, which creates a negative and deficiency narrative. So, how one is portrayed impacts how a problem is defined and subsequently what solution is sought. The role one is to have is also seen to impact the understanding of how these individuals are impacted and whom is seen to be impacted. Role narratives, specifically focusing on disabled people within technology, as mentioned earlier, they might be therapeutic or non-therapeutic users of these technologies. They might be beneficiaries or victims. They could also be engaged as knowledge producers or knowledge consumers of these AI and ML products. And ultimately, they can influence how knowledge is produced around science and technology. They can be influential as ethics and governance discourses are developed as well. So the objective of my studies was to identify the terminology and imagery of disabled people within AI and ML, academic literature, newspapers, and Twitter, to ascertain the problems linked to disabled people and particularly focusing on social problems, and to ascertain how the literature engaged with public engagement, knowledge production, ethics, and AI governance in relation to disabled people. I just want to briefly outline the search strategies utilized. So in all academic searches, we used EBSCOL and Scopus. And here with our academic ethic focus, those were the key terms searched, producing 987 abstracts, which were downloaded. In search strategy 1B, this was focusing on journal titles and with a focus on ethics. We see with those search terms there, within Scopus, there were 711 academic abstracts downloaded. Focusing on academic literature in general without that ethics focus. We use those key terms listed there, producing 614 academic abstracts. Within academic journal titles, focusing on AI, ML, and then disabled people as well, we see 644 abstracts were downloaded. Then focusing on newspapers, using Canadian Newsstream as the source, we downloaded 793 newspaper articles. And then within Twitter, We used similar key terms in regard to AI, ML, and disabled people, which produced a total of 2,879 tweets. So now we'll move into the results of my study here. One theme found within this search strategy and the subsequent search strategy is that the term patient or the healthcare medical focused narrative was used 10 times more than a non-health focused term, and also within the academic literature as well. The term patient is used far more than any disability-related term. As we're focusing in on the journal titles, we've here outlined those that were focused in the medical narratives versus social or AI and computer, and it was dominantly focused within the medical field. Again, here we see, even in the newspaper narratives, we see similar finding in our Twitter results with over 1,800 patient hits compared to 22 people with disability hits. Now, to summarize the themes within the content analyzed, these were the major areas we saw where there was a gap, and these topics were not mentioned. So the social implications for humans that are using AI and ML processes was not discussed. The impacts of autonomous technologies were not discussed, nor was AI governance, public engagement, active citizenship, or knowledge production. In summary, through the various discourses analyzed, the main role ascribed to disabled people was that of being a therapeutic or non-therapeutic user, or patient. And it was often discussed how AI and ML technologies support disabled people in fulfilling roles and identities. Interestingly, the AI and ML focused literature did not talk about and narrow in on social good specifically for disabled people. They weren't even mentioned once. As such, there is an immense gap in both academic literature, Canadian newspapers, and Twitter that needs to be filled in regard to how disabled people are impacted by these technologies, by the changing societal impacts of the technologies, and how AI/ML governance is needed in regard to disabled people and promoting them as active citizens. We also note that AI and ML literature has a major focus around medical imagery and medical narratives within ethics discourses, which can be highly problematic. Identity theory suggests that the perception itself is often influenced by the role one occupies in the social world. And as discussed quite in depth so far, we see that disabled people are only really ascribed to the therapeutic or non-therapeutic role and as a patient. And so if they're only seen and described within these roles within the literature, how are they going to fulfill further roles such as knowledge producer, a policy influencer? Narrowing the roles of disabled people to being a therapeutic or non-therapeutic patient identity is very problematic. Techno-optimism was a general theme throughout the literature analyzed, specifically within Twitter results. And this techno-optimism really focuses on how these technologies are going to improve the lives of disabled people, help them fulfill certain roles. But again, if we are only narrowing their roles to being therapeutic or non-therapeutic users of technologies, it's really not serving disabled people well. AI and ML discussions have the potential to engage disabled people further. For example, as active citizens, as knowledge producers, and there are a number of other issues at stake for disabled people that aren't discussed within the literature. Health and healthcare is a major theme within the existing literature. However, this is highly problematic. So in conclusion, the coverage of AI and ML in relation to disabled people was highly techno-optimistic and does not lend itself well to cover disabled people in exploring the negative implications of technologies. Our study also suggests that there is a need to diversify the coverage of disabled people to broaden the discussions around disabled people's role, their identity, and lastly, our findings suggest that there is minor to no engagement with ethics and AI or ML in relation to disabled people. Given the results of this study, we suggest that there is a need to investigate how academics choose their topics of investigation and why the topics we found lacking were not chosen. It's also necessary to investigate why disabled students are not acting as knowledge producers and they're not engaging within these fields. And lastly, it might be useful to interview disabled students or disabled academics to understand their perspectives and why these problems exist. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening in today, and it's a pleasure to share my research with you. If you have any further questions, feel free to contact me at my email on the screen there.